Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon when you are viewing this webinar. My name is Dave Nagel, and I'm very excited to have an opportunity to meet on and share some insight and expertise around what really drives impact into student learning in collaboration models in schools and PLC settings at the upcoming Wyoming School Boards Association conference next week in Casper, Wyoming. This is sort of a opening preview webinar that some folks will have an opportunity to watch, others might not have a chance to. But I wanted to set the stage for those of you who might have a consideration to attend my session, what we will discuss and talk about. And in a conference such as we're going to plan to have here next week, there's so many sessions that folks are going to have a chance to attend to. And in an hour's time frame, it's very difficult to get into a great deal of content and processes and address all of the questions. So I thought this would be a great opportunity to do what we do a lot now in our classrooms in terms of flipping the instruction and at least setting the stage. So for those of you who view this will provide some insight for folks who might attend my session and view this afterwards. I don't think it will do any harm at all to view it after as a kind of follow-up. So I want to ask just a kind of an opening question when we talk about our professional learning communities, our collaborative settings in our schools. And I want to stress that's at the classroom teacher level, at the building level. Our administrative teams and even our school board, in a sense, is a professional learning community. But specifically, thinking about the schools that we serve and the students and teachers that we are trying, or the teachers that we're trying to empower to serve our students, when they come together, are they having the greatest impact possible on student learning? And I think it's a fair question to ask when we provide collaboration time for teachers and administrators. It's at a cost. It's at a structure in terms of our school environment, our scheduling that is an investment. It's an investment of time and certainly other resources. So we have to ask that question. Are our professional learning communities, our collaborative settings, having the greatest impact possible? And it's interesting when we look at the evidence, and there is not a great deal of empirical research evidence around professional learning communities because Vesio and her colleagues at Florida State, they combed the literature to find what were the true deep empirical research studies that they could use through a strong vetting process, meaning that we don't want to include any of the research studies that included some of the individuals who were conducting that. If I'm a teacher and I say that my students I felt were doing better, or my administrator involved said that his teachers were changing their impact. So they had to have a strong vetting system. And they found about 13 research studies that they included 11. And basically what they found, when teams have these four attributes, they set goals, they have shared common values about learning and teaching, there's a positive relationship amongst the adults, and the culture is collaborative. When those things are in place, that contributed as much as 36% variance in the quality of classroom instructional practices that took place, and as much as 85% the variance in positive gains and achievement. The question that we all have to ask is, many of our teams might have this. They might set goals. They seem to really get along. They seem to have shared values and collaborate. So if that was the case, why aren't they having the kind of impact that the evidence tells us that they should have? So I want to highlight just a few pieces in this webinar that will go into more depth when we come back together, hopefully next Thursday in Casper. A little bit about myself. I wanted to introduce myself. Again, my name is Dave Nagel. I've been in education for 20 years. I won't read every bullet point, but my time as a teacher and administrator was at the middle and high school level. But I've been doing professional development work since approximately around 2003, and pretty much full-time since 2008 with multiple companies such as a Leadership and Learning Center, which is an organization Doug Reeves founded. I do a lot of my work now through Corwin, Invisible, Invisible Learning and other pieces. But I'm always sort of representing myself and my own company, which is called NZJ Learning. And I'm going to highlight what that means in a minute. And I'm very passionate about grading and assessment. And my first publication came out 2 years ago with Corwin. And while it focuses on secondary, to really drive through collaboration what grading and feedback practices need to take place to increase student learning. But as I mentioned a moment ago, my company, NZJ Learning, is pretty simple. When I formed my company, I had to have a name, and it stands for these guys. My 12-year-old Nicholas. When he comes home from school, I always ask him, not what he learned, what feedback did he receive? Because I want his teachers, hopefully in a collaborative setting, to talk about how they empower students to seek and guide their own learning through feedback that they can provide themselves. And the other end of the spectrum, the other two letters are for these guys, Zachary and Jacob. And at their age, what I challenge them every day when they come home from preschool and first grade is, what mistakes did you make? I want my students, my children, to embrace the fact that mistakes are a gem, that we embrace learning through error. Same thing has to be applicable at the adult level. So as we talk about our collaborative settings, do our teachers feel that it's safe to make mistakes? But I always like to highlight, well, what is NCJ learning? It's just simply the names of my three little guys. Obviously, this isn't an interactive webinar, but I wanted to have a quick commitment to that, so I've placed my cell phone number, my email, and my Twitter handle. If you have any thoughts or questions prior to our session next week in Wyoming or after, please take a moment, shoot me an email. Be happy to engage in a phone conversation, or if you're viewing this after the fact, anytime I can follow up with some conversation, maybe even a conference call with yourself, your board, superintendent, administrators, or even bringing some teachers involved. Please know I would embrace that at any time. So I'll walk through a couple of highlight pieces that I want to kind of get us thinking about going into next week. But as I mentioned before with VETSIO's study, there's a reason why PLCs that have those pieces in place haven't had the kind of impact they should. The first one is that our teachers can come together, and whether it's because of a pecking order, because of a wrong protocol, or because they don't quite have enough tools in their toolbox, we can actually validate ineffective practices. Far too often, the teachers might come together and focus more on the teaching and not the learning, and not what strategy did I put in place or did we put in place? What was the impact on learning? How do we know that it worked? It can be a place to avoid change. It can be a place where the status quo is promoted because we're not looking at the evidence in student work and student assessments. We're not looking at the evidence in terms of growth over time with our large-scale assessments, what we look at from a school level or even district level. And unfortunately, PLC can become a common term for any conversation. And so how do we talk about when we are truly having a learning meeting, which is what the L stands for, and it's the adult learning, not necessarily the students. The adults learn first so they can better impact how they work with students. And then finally, some false assumptions, and false assumption that school leaders can make. That if the PLC atmosphere is friendly, that they're doing quite well. It's possible, but not always is that the case. Sometimes too much harmony might lead to a lack of challenging practices in the right, healthy way to grow and develop. That just because we've changed the culture, that there's a change in practice, whether it's at the school or classroom level. Just increasing the amount of collaboration doesn't necessarily increase the amount of student or teacher learning. We can add more collaborative time, but it's what we do with the time that we have that matters. Or if one PLC is seeming to be effective, well, then they all must be. And certainly that's not the case. We can have one or two grade level teams that are working very well, or even a school level team that's working well. We've got to be able to dig in even more. And so I'm going to guide us through this webinar briefly, but then highlight some more intentional pieces when we come together next week of 5 critical elements that will drive impact into our collaboration. Common challenges, relational trust, efficacy through empowerment, authentic instructional protocols, which I will highlight one specifically, and that there's a focus on the adult learning, that the mind frame that the adults embrace is they focus on learning, not teaching. Certainly they're going to be teaching at some point in time. Certainly the administrators are going to administrate, but the focus is first and foremost on the learning. And the idea of developing common challenges, that when teams come together, when school boards come together, for example, we are focusing on certain elements that will drive not only our passions, but our efforts to focus on how those efforts can drive to have the greatest possible impact. And so we're monitoring very specific things over time. And I'm going to highlight and share some tools when we come together next week that will help that happen at the classroom teacher level, the building level, certainly at the district level, and also at the school board level as well. When we think about at the teacher level, which is where the rubber meets the road, where student learning is going to grow or stagnate or be augmented or possibly be limited, when teachers have a common challenge, it guides their dialogue. So their dialogue stays focused. And as we all know as adults, we can be of any profession, any walk of life, and to stay focused on the topic is difficult. But the more we have a common challenge, and I use the metaphor of football coaches when they come together in their team meetings, the coaches meeting, they often have common challenges that they're trying to put in place when they go out onto the practice field to execute for the upcoming game. And it focuses the dialogue that they will have. Next, there must be relational trust. Joyce and Showers, Brick and Schneider, many large-scale studies found that schools and school systems, for example, Brick and Schneider's analysis of the Chicago public school turnaround at the first part of this century, found that one of the only key elements of the schools that made gains was relational trust within the collaborative PLC setting. But teachers need to take risks. They need to feel like they can make a mistake, as I mentioned earlier with my 2 little guys, and that they know that they'll be supported, And that's where the mutual trust comes into place. Lencioni's work, which is a driver in a lot of the things when I'm working with teams, getting them moving. And you see sort of their kind of Maslow hierarchy of needs as he talks about what drives possible dysfunctions. And I was with a group of teachers recently where when we looked at this model and looked at some more in-depth elements of it, and he kind of said, I'm not sure if we avoid conflict because there's an absence of trust, or there's an absence of trust because we avoid the conflict. We have to be able to confront difficult issues, and certainly at the school board level, we face difficult issues all the time. We have to come together with protocols and processes so that way we use the right evidence to drive the best decision, because we're not always going to agree. That disagreement isn't a bad thing. We've got to make sure it doesn't stagnate or disempower a team to move forward. And that relational trust is developed and cultivated by structures that create positive interdependence. We don't just say we're going to have relational trust. We have to put structures in place that drive the work to happen so that way interdependence becomes natural. And I love this quote that I've kind of put together from some of the sort of what I want to call biggies in terms of their empirical research and PLCs over time, that collective responsibility for student learning is really vital. And when a group of teachers comes together, they're just as accountable for my students as they are for their own, and vice versa. I've got to make sure I'm thinking about strategies and ideas that I share with my peers and be willing to come to them when I have a challenge. And it creates proper peer pressure and eliminates what happens in our profession very often, which is that isolation. That isolation can happen at the teacher level and certainly at the administrative level as well. And that collective responsibility from that common challenge can really drive more sharing of vital strategies and determining indicators if they work. And the metaphor that I use that we want to avoid is a track team, because no matter how far the shot putter throws that ball, that shot put, that isn't going to help the high jumper. They can clap and they can cheer for each other, but at the end of the day, they just kind of throw their points in the pot. We want to avoid that. We want to make sure that we're dependent upon each other in a positive way. And one of the things that administrators and certainly department chairs and school boards and superintendents can do is to make sure that we provide the right environment. So that way we realize some teams, if they are together, collaboration can become stifling. Too little of it leads to isolation. So how do we create the structures that way teams are accountable to each other, but they don't always have to be in the room every time to collaborate? Certainly in 2016, there's things we can do through Google Docs and electronic communication where we can have certain tasks we have to complete by a certain time. So when we do come together with the limited time we have, we can make the most out of it during our collaborative settings. And then there must be fine-grained discourse around student learning. That we have to dig in and at the classroom teacher level look at specific student work. When we're looking at the administrative or building level, we're not just looking at overall scores. We're digging into some of those specific strands. We're also at all levels looking at voice evidence. We're collecting voice evidence around how students and teachers feel about safe and making mistakes, acknowledging feedback, feeling that their voice is heard. So we'll talk a lot about there's data and evidence. Data is a form of evidence, but an evidence can actually be how a student felt whether or not the assignment or task or assessment was challenging, was too easy, felt like they didn't actually know what the questions were asking them. As teachers, they can do the same thing. They feel like they can have a voice in terms of when an administrator comes in their room, they know what should be expected, and it's not a guessing game. All of these are elements that will drive impact when we come together and collaborate more than just on final input scores. One of my final points is that teachers have to be able to develop mastery learning experiences. Far too often, professional development is judged by the exit tickets at the end of the day. We have to allow teachers to give us feedback at the end of a professional learning session, perhaps on PLCs, but then allow them time to practice new strategies and skills, whether they're around assessment, whether they're around RTI, whether they're around any element of our professional development initiatives in our schools and districts throughout the state of Wyoming. And the PLC setting, the collaborative setting, is a perfect place for teachers to practice, to be able to share with their peers. Here's what I'm really strong at. Here's where one of my weaknesses are that maybe you can help me offset that, and I can help offset some of yours. And they get really, really good at certain strategies, and they have a safe environment to practice it. Safe meaning they can make mistakes, and safe meaning they can receive honest, efficacious feedback from their peers when to be able to know, hey, my peers are telling me that as much as I thought it was really solid, maybe there's a place to grow, or I might not have thought it was this good, but my peers gave me honest feedback and I have more confidence now. So finally, talked about protocols in my opening slide. One of the key elements that I want to bring into place is how we develop protocols. And the one that I work with schools and districts all over the country with is what I call impact PLTs, IPLTs, impact professional learning teams. And it's a simple 4-step process where we chart and examine our evidence. As I mentioned a moment ago, some of that evidence is specific student achievement data. Sometimes that evidence is the voice evidence from our teachers, from our students, even from parents. We formulate inferences into learning, student learning specifically, the classroom level. What are we determining as a quality inference about what we're seeing? Then we determine our actions and our strategies. I'm going to talk about the difference between the two. The strategy is a specific thing we're going to put in place, the guided practice, the modeling. The action is we're going to provide a certain amount of time for that to happen in the classroom. Our action is going to be that we're going to listen to certain constituents in the community, voice their opinion about a new referendum we're passing. One of the strategies we're going to use is we're going to highlight ahead of time with some pre-created webinars and pre-created pamphlets that are going to say, here's exactly what we're thinking about. So I'm going to talk a lot about the actual strategy we put in place. The action is the structure through which that strategy comes to life. And then finally, we must establish ahead of time, what are some success indicators? What are some pieces of evidence we're going to look for to determine if our strategies and actions are working? And that's something at the classroom teacher level, at the PLC level, is very empowering. Far too often we get kind of caught up in, did it work? Did the students get it or not? And a lot of learning that takes place in our schools across the board is conceptual learning. Students and humans learn concepts over time. So what are those indicators of success that we want to monitor and look for over time so we don't make some erroneous judgments to abandon a strategy that actually is working? I thank you so much for your time and listening to this webinar. If you have any questions, please, you have my email, my cell phone number, and then my 2 sessions will take place next Thursday at 1:30 and 2:30 in the Central Ballroom. Some of you might be watching this webinar afterwards and you've already attended my session, so I really appreciate your opportunity to meet you in person and then have a chance to follow up or possibly watch this webinar before. Look forward to seeing everybody next week in Casper, Wyoming. Have a great rest of your week, and I look forward to talking with everyone soon.